Make sure I... So we've had introductions to most of the people on the policy roundtable. We have several newcomers. So why don't we just start again on this end and just briefly introduce yourself. And obviously, if you work for a drug manufacturer, you probably have some conflicts. But for the other folks, just if there are any personal or kind of professional conflicts, please let the audience know. So Andreas, would you just start again?
Sorry. Yeah, Andreas Kuznik. I'm with Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. I represent the Sanofi Genzyme Regeneron Alliance on the panel.
And my name is Tom Amoroso. I'm the Medical Director for Medical Policy at Tufts Health Plan.
Hi, I'm Rob Zavosky. I'm the Medical Director with the Connecticut Department of Social Services, and I have no disclosures.
Matt Liang. I'm a non-boarded rheumatologist, general internist. Work between the Brigham and the VA, where I ran the section and also do large clinical trials. And my family has a lot of stock in J&J.
Sounds good. Hi, I'm Sandy.
Oops, sorry, have to hit.
It went off, sorry. And I am retired from Abbott Laboratories.
Jan Wyatt. I am a patient with rheumatoid arthritis. I've had rheumatoid arthritis for about 15 years. And I'm a retired nurse practitioner and nurse executive.
Good afternoon, Himanshu Patel. I'm with Eli Lilly. I am on the Senior Medical Advisor U.S. affiliate side, so the medical side.
Andy Laster. I'm a rheumatologist in private practice in Charlotte, North Carolina, ACR member, and on the board of advisors for United Rheumatology, which is a 300-member community-based group of independent rheumatologists.
All right, great. So, I'm going to make sure this is on for people. Good? Make sure they can hear me. All right. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to start by saying it's very tempting to try to create a clinical guideline from scratch almost, because we've talked a lot about some of the ins and the outs. In a lot of ways, what I want the discussion to focus on is the interaction between the evidence as we've discussed it today and coverage issues largely. Where does the coverage seem to line up with the evidence? Where are the tensions? And this is a rich area where we need to think about broader benefits and contextual issues from the patients and other people's perspectives. So I'd love just to start actually from the patient perspective, having heard the conversation today, and as we now turn to start to thinking about translating the votes and the thoughts about the evidence into, in a sense, thinking about how this should be reflected in clinical practice and coverage, and we'll talk about pricing too, but from the patient perspective, what's missing or what needs to be emphasized again, what really stands out to you to kind of highlight where we start from now?
Well, thank you for this opportunity, and appreciated, as I read the report, ICER's real value about the patient-provider relationship, recognizing how important that is. But value is sort of an area that I think we need to explore and explode perhaps a little bit more. What I felt was missing was a lot of patient-reported outcomes information. There was, if you look at the ACR, there are 7 core measures. Most of them are actually physician-directed in terms of joint count, so that's not really a lot of patient-reported information. And yet the ACR 20, 50, 70 was really an important measure for clinical effectiveness. I have left knee replacement surgery. I have a combination of OA and RA, and so as you look at the X-ray measure that was deemed to be important for clinical success, as a clinical success measure, I was concerned that that was not really acutely sufficient to be able to provide a real true clinical measure. And there are really good, valid, and reliable patient-reported outcomes measures out there that I would hope would wend their way into clinical trials as well as post-market clinical effectiveness information. And the economic issue is one that's absolutely critical for all of us as patients. We are pretty much economically invisible as patients in our healthcare system. We're the only ones that don't make money. And we spend a lot of money. We have a lot of co-pays, we have co-insurance, we have a lot of burdens financially. And we have no idea where these cost points that we are required to pay, how they're calculated or where they come from. So there's a lot of confusion, and confusion translates for us into a threat to access. And so we very much, going forward, hope that ICER is able to explode that value concept to create more economic transparency and better clinical measures.
All right, thank you. Sandy, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the concerns that we have is how do you look at the total patient? The comorbidities, where are, the pain medications that mask some of those symptoms? How really do the surgeries that so many of these patients have to encounter play? And then, there's that age issue, the woman question of whether you're in childbearing age or you're in menopause, since that's a large percentage of this population. So I guess what I would say is I truly understand that perfect is the enemy of good, but I'm concerned that, we're not totally at good in terms of our ability to understand and digest all the things that need to go into a value model. So I'm concerned about all the things that we don't know. I'm also concerned about the fact that biosimilars are not on the market, and yet that will have a radical impact on this patient population, and that should be coming within the next couple of years. I'm also concerned about what it is that's going to require a revision in this report, given the biosimilars being on the cliff. So I have a lot of unknowns and a relative amount of discomfort because I couldn't even list all my unknowns for you.
Thank you. That's dealing with the uncertainty that exists now, and it will, as you said, it's a very rapidly changing landscape. I just wanted to note that your comment about the patient-centered outcome and patient-reported outcomes is a really interesting one, because, I mean, rheumatoid arthritis is an area, it's almost kind of one of the kind of idolized areas where doctors started to come up with better outcome measures. And yet, at the end of the day, when we and payers and others are trying to look at and make comparisons, what a messy soup of these different acronym-based outcome measures, which have all been changing over time. We've got Sharp scores that aren't even measured the same today as they were a few years ago. So talk about the good or the perfect being the enemy of the good. It's almost as if the evolution towards even better patient measures has made it more difficult to make a comparison to any drug that was, put on the market 3, 4, 5 years ago, because they were using different outcome measures. But it has to be something that clinical researchers think a lot about, and certainly the manufacturing community. What kind of recommendations or proposals can we put out that would help standardize and systematize the types of outcome measures that are being used? They have to be broad, but how do we get them similar enough across drugs so that we can do a better job of kind of guiding practice? Any thoughts or experiences from the manufacturer's perspective on this? Because it's a mess.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks, Steve, for having us on. Lily greatly appreciates the opportunity. So one thing I didn't mention, I did work as a rheumatologist for over 14 years seeing patients. So I was doing that part of my life with Lily. I think we've come a long way when it comes to clinical trials, but we've also reached some limitations. I think when we look at some of these dichotomous endpoints, whether a patient has a remission versus no remission, low disease activity versus not, just going through these dichotomous type endpoints, I think you do lose some sensitivity. I think moving in the future, hopefully we can see things like ACR hybrid type models that go into continuous variable type scenarios. So we can, look at that standpoint instead of the dichotomous. I think one other comment on, in terms of looking at endpoints, I think Sharp scores specifically. Something I think we have to keep in mind is that these patients are starting off at different time points when they start at baseline. So I think something, and hopefully the panel can comment more on this, but I think sort of having a discussion and having a movement towards having more stratification at baseline for these patients and seeing their baseline sharp score, looking at their poor prognostic markers at baseline and looking at those specific stratified patient groups versus the whole group may certainly shed some light given the fact that 85 to 90% of these patients are having no radiographic changes whatsoever in clinical trials.
Any thoughts from the clinical experts about this tension around patient outcomes?
I confess, I aided and abetted this patient-oriented stuff, and I can tell you from personal scars in other areas that trying to do it by sociology is impossible. You know, each inventor thinks they have the best mousetrap. We've tried to legislate it. That doesn't work. There's statistical techniques, obviously, to
Right.
walk across different scales, like creating a statistical Rosetta Stone to walk through. I think that might be the best. But the other one, which might be a thing that we could explore, is if someone did it as a basis for reimbursement. And I think that would quickly get people to use at least some common metrics. And that's why I was trying to link that to the earlier suggestion that, you know, we're in an era now where this is a 5-digit intervention per year. We're 6-digit interventions per year in terms of capacity. And then with precision medicine coming down the road, I think this model is run out of steam. And my last FDA advisory committee in lupus, you know, another rheumatic disease, there was a new drug after 25 years of nothing new with an effect size that none of the clinicians could see as being very useful. And in the morning, we thought it was dead on arrival. And then the patients got up and we all cried. And they said, we know this is not a cure, but we need hope. And it got, you know, approved. At least now that drug is available and we can see what it really does in real life. And I wonder that what we should really spend our time doing is lowering the bar for approval, but also insisting that on the basis of approval that we have to get some common metrics to inform, you know, when we try to tie in real life, we never have the data. And I must back up and say, having done this kind of work before, I sat back with admiration at what you've accomplished and done, the rigor and the attention to detail. But I also felt really sorry for you because I knew that you would inevitably end up, as it always occurs, a mud fight with industry representatives who have a vested interest in undermining your assumptions. I'm sorry about that, but that's how I feel. And the academics who don't see patients, who also can, you know, tell you the weaknesses in them. And so I think that this is the inevitable course of this kind of analysis, that you never have the data. It's old. It's based on RCTs. And I remind you of Alan Shapiro's reference class paradox. If you look at primary data from trials, comparison between any two interventions, there's always a group that is not the ultimate winner who gets okay or better. And when patients roll into good doctors' offices like Dr. Lester, they don't know which member of the group they are in. So despite all of the tools that we have, it's basically a trial and error. And you try to do it with the patient's interests at heart and involve them in the decision making. And it only takes one vote no to move on to another drug. And it may not have anything to do with the DAS or anything that's objective, but it's meaningful. And if we're really trying to do that with policy, I think we should enable it with some more information. So.
Thank you. So I was just going to say, so at least from my perspective, part of what we heard from the patient community is, again, not just the diversity of patients, but the diversity of, well, it is linked to that. Experiencing RA is very different patient by patient. And so to have one outcome, like the number of swollen joints, may not really capture the benefits or differential benefits of drugs for certain kinds of patients. So there's a natural desire to multiply the types of outcome measures that we would use to try to capture all the, the ways that these drugs can benefit patients and differ from each other. But every time we do that, we complicate, in some ways, the ability to make comparisons. We ask drug companies to do 20 outcomes, 22 outcomes, per trial. So it gets very tricky. But again, from the very selfish perspective of those who end up kind of reading the literature and trying to understand it and compare, at least if things like sharp scores were measured the same way, we could do better. And we have to make sure that these different tools are administered in the same way so that we can make better indirect comparisons. I hope that was something like what you were going to say.
Yeah, we're getting there. So, you talked about how can you do a better clinical trial? Can we come up with better metrics? What can we do to incorporate more patient outcome data? It's really, and we'll talk about some of the challenges in terms of trials that are not reflective of people in practice. So the answer, may in fact be in the rheumatologist office. Okay, so we are, we do a treat to target. We're very rigorous now in terms of what we do. We identify a target at 3 months. We have metrics that are much better now than we've had before. And the rheumatologist in the office is recording the data. So every RA patient gets a tender joint count, a swollen joint count. There's a patient global. We do a rapid hack. There's a pain and function component. And an MD global, right? And we calculate a CDI on every patient who has rheumatoid arthritis. So, the hope is that organizations like United Rheumatology, others, there are a number of other databases out there, will begin to accumulate the data that we really need that takes into account the fact that if you've seen one RA patient, you've only seen one patient with rheumatoid arthritis, and begins to factor in the complexity and begins to look at the utility and the morbidity and the things that we're trying to grapple with, indirectly through clinical trials.
That's good. Yeah, please, Jan.
And I very much appreciate that. My frustration in that the primary data was all clinical trial data is that the purpose of the clinical trial is drug approval and efficacy, not necessarily effectiveness. Efficacy being, does it do what you hope it's supposed to do? So true clinical effectiveness research is really the day-to-day slog of patients through the rheumatologist office. And all the things that we bring to that visit, our comorbidities, our past surgery, our coexisting OA with the RA, and many people say that arthritis, indeed, the inflammatory arthritis is on a continuum and eventually will become degenerative, so you got to get OA anyway. And so how that, I believe, would complicate any sort of X-ray monitoring score. But it's really something that I hope happens is that we move on to true clinical effectiveness research, not the clinical efficacy research that really is representative in the clinical trials. But I also want to mention that very, very smart people have identified 3 major sources of knowledge when you talk about our healthcare system and treatment. One, of course, is clinical trials, and that's really important. But what people tend to do is overvalue that, perhaps, and not necessarily value the wonderful expertise of our rheumatology and medical community, but also the expertise that patients would bring. So somehow the value of all 3 of those need to be balanced.
All right. So even though I said we're not going to build a guideline, I'd like to actually try to do almost a rapid-fire work with some of the clinical experts and others that can chime in to address some of the areas where I think there are questions that would be related to a guideline that may have been touched upon in the discussion of evidence today. Or there may be some tension between some of the decision-making that clinicians and patients would take and some of the coverage policies, at least as we see them today. So a couple, and hopefully these can be kind of quick. We didn't talk too much about it today, but I know from a coverage perspective, there's a question sometimes, before even starting a biologic DMARD, is there work that needs to be done to make sure that methotrexate dosing is kind of maximized, is appropriate? Is that a reasonable prior authorization request from a health plan to make sure that that's happened?
Yeah, I definitely think that. I think that rheumatologists really have part of the blame to play here in terms of not maximizing methotrexate. If we look at the doses of methotrexate that have been used in The UAB group, for example, has some really good data, that on average your dose of methotrexate before you go on to a biologic is about 15 milligrams. And we appreciate now that as you go up on the oral dose up to 25 milligrams, if you divide the dose morning and evening, the absorption is better. If you switch to sub-Q, some people don't absorb the pill well. The sub-Q dose can be absorbed, but there are people who are hyper-excretors and have other problems, and so there's a role now for actually measuring methotrexate levels. And so one can look at an RBC, methotrexate RBC polyglutamate level to actually determine whether you're on a therapeutic amount. And we think that, if we can do that better, we're going to have more people who are going to remain longer on DMARDs before they get to a biologic. We may not prevent everybody from getting to a biologic, but I think we're clearly under-treating. And again, if we look at all of these trials, they entered and they were said to be uncontrolled, but it could be that if they had been more rigorous in terms of their methotrexate dose, they might not be there at that point.
Okay.
I'd just like to add that the
Sure.
Arthritis Foundation shares your feeling that, there is an
So I can
opportunity.
get closer to the mic.
Sorry, there is an opportunity to start on methotrexate and to work up as long as the utilization management strategy allows for the physician to override any of those steps that are put in place by the insurer. So that would just be a little proviso there. And also, if you do step through, that you not have to go through step therapy a second time for the same diagnosis, which we find is happening to some of our patient population.
Right. So,
And I would absolutely, I'm going to speak from my patient perspective. I was on conventional DMARD therapy for about 18 to 24 months before I was started on a biologic. I have actually gone through 3 biologics. Third biologic had a severe adverse reaction, nervous system reaction. But and I'm back on DMARD therapy now and hope to get to another TIMS soon. But one of the concerns I had is in the model is that there was a requirement for a 6 months evaluation for whether the therapy had worked. And for those of us that have been on conventional DMARD therapy, we walk back and forth between our methotrexate doses. When we're feeling pretty good, perhaps we're down as low as 10, even less, and then we march up to 12 and a half, and so on, 15, 17, until our symptoms are managed. But my rheumatologist tells me that methotrexate will take potentially up to 2 to 3 months to provide, a true picture of clinical success. And if I have an infection during that period of 2 to 3 months, then I'm going to have to stop my methotrexate therapy, restart. So the model as it's presented, the care model proposed requiring that 6-month snapshot, perhaps is not as accurate as, or not designed as well as it should be.
all right.
Maybe I can
So,
sort of add some color
Please.
from the industry perspective. So as a health economist, it's really hard to disagree. You have a drug that costs tens of thousands of dollars versus a drug that costs pennies. Try the cheap one first. If it works, great. If it doesn't, then there are obviously other options. Now, what I would like to point out, though, is that if you're going to go through a step therapy through methotrexate, there ought to be a sort of organized medical exception process in place in those cases where methotrexate is contraindicated or not appropriate. I think methotrexate does have issues with in women with childbearing age, and there are other groups of people that probably shouldn't be on it. So, as long as you have a process in place that sort of screens these people and identifies where these exceptions are reasonable, then I can't really disagree with it.
all right. I'm going to come back to the step therapy, don't worry.
Okay.
Oh, you want to say something now? Jump in.
I'm happy to say something now.
Jump in.
Because I'm the guy who sits behind the utilization review desk, at least some portion of the time. And, in some ways, there's a part of me that is wondering who is ensuring some of the folks who are telling us that, there's no process whereby we can overcome the step therapy. And again, I can only speak to my plan and my state. I work for a regional insurer. We insure in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. All of those states, to my knowledge, essentially require that there be a process for that very thing. If you, as the physician, feel that a patient cannot tolerate methotrexate for any reason, one, it would be ever so helpful if you wrote that in the request, which often you don't. And I say you generally, physicians as a class don't. I don't want to be pointing fingers at anybody. But in addition, if, let's say that, you know, you wrote it in your request in what you thought were appropriate words, and you got a reviewer who, like myself, is an emergency physician, not a rheumatologist, and he or she says no, well, then you pick up the telephone and you call them. Every insurer has a process whereby you can call them. It may not be an easy process. Ours is not, and we're in the process of revising it, but nevertheless, there is that opportunity. And I'm not sure that a lot of physicians particularly take as much advantage of that as they ought to.
We will circle back to this. Because if we stay here, we will never get out.
I'm sure we'll be back around to this again.
We will be back around.
I spend
Okay.
a lot of time on the phone.
Go. Yes, I.
So do I.
Coming back, yes, coming back. I think we need a real-world study of step therapy to see efficacy and effectiveness. All right, so back to not building a guideline. Let's do some more building. Okay, so the methotrexate doesn't work well enough. So the European Union guidelines, and forgive me because they came out just a month or so ago, and so I'm more fixated on them. They talk a lot about, you know, separating patients by their prognostic risks. You know, they're either kind of put into a low risk pile and a high risk pile. If you're in a low risk pile, the European guidelines say add another conventional DMARD. If you're high risk, you can go to a biologic or a targeted, you know, a JAK inhibitor, for instance. So does clinical practice in the U.S. work on this stratification kind of mindset? And how does that line up with coverage policies? Is there an ability to fail methotrexate, go to biologic, or is that just the way it's done in the States and people don't add a second CDMARD after methotrexate? What's going on?
Yeah, so there are ACR guidelines. So in 2015, they came out with the guidelines for RA, and actually the earlier guidelines, I think from 2012, did highlight this poor prognostic factor, and it's something that all of us do in practice. And if a patient comes in and they have rheumatoid nodules, they have high disease burden, they have evidence of erosions, their rheumatoid factor, their ACPA are very high. Those are clearly people we're concerned about and are more aggressive. You know, but I think a lot of those people are going to fall into the, you know, moderate to high disease activity anyway, and so they are important, but they're not huge differences, I think, between EULAR and the ACR guidelines. We've got, you know, definite guidelines. They both talk about treat to target. You know, they both are identifying risk, and the rheumatologist treating that patient is acting accordingly. So the patient at high risk, whether they have high disease activity or poor prognostic factors, is then going to have available to them, you know, a number of drugs after moving from the DMARDs, not just one specific biologic.
Matt, did you want to comment on that?
Context, I've been a salary doc.
So you have to hit that button again.
And I can say that our healthcare system is broken because you only do what you can get paid for. And if you have any cross-cultural or international experience, we are the highest percentage of biologic users in RA. I mean, I think there's data, but I'm not, you know, on top of it. But I've trained many fellows from overseas, and I get this back. And, you know, I've lived through that period where we had nothing but to shuffle NSAIDs or gold. We had nothing really effective, but we always had to do something different when someone was doing bad. Lousy drugs, but we did the best we could. Then biologics came, and basically the profession became a lucrative profession for some because we had the infusion compensation. So I think that we have to be very careful because guidelines, and I actually honchoed the first three at ACR. And I've found that they're quite useless. People don't read them. The insurers do, the reviewers do, but people can game them. The guideline committees are now being populated by people with heavy conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. I think it's not really done anything for healthcare improvement, is my personal bias. So I'm not sure I want to spend my time trying to write out every possibility. Maybe it's better, like General Patton advised, that you tell people the problem you want to solve or the DAS score you want to achieve and let them figure out a way to do it. better.
Interesting. So,
If one of,
sorry, real quickly, and then I want to get to the insurers on this question too. So go ahead. Whoever's, Sandy, were you next?
Okay.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
No, I was listening intently.
Oh, okay, come on, go ahead.
So I was just going to say a couple things. You know, so something that, you know, I always did as a practitioner is I prescribed a lot of methotrexate. But the conundrum here is that how well do patients adhere to it and how tolerable is it? So, you know, we can look at clinical trials and you still have about a 10 to 15% DC rate on methotrexate under tightly controlled situations. You can double that number when you talk about real world. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is you take a patient that's on methotrexate with inadequate response and you put them on a biologic. You know, the registry data and other data to support this, you see these patients dropping off on their methotrexate. So now they're on a monotherapy arm that's going on. And finally, to follow along with what Matthew was saying, I think the guidelines are you know, always have to be taken with a grain of salt. You have you know, these strong or conditional recommendations, and you have to really translate that into the real world. You know, so if you looked at the 2015 guidelines for an established RA patient, they would say to start a DMARD monotherapy. But in the real world, you know, if you have poor prognostic indicators and you have a patient that has that moderate to severe RA, a lot of practitioners will want to use combination therapy right from the start. So I think we have to sort of realize these things and be careful about making a strict policy, or not policy, but strict sort of protocols based off of guideline alone.
Okay, so that's a good segue. Strict protocol, insurers. What do you, I don't know if you know, I assume you looked at your own policies before you came here.
On a regular basis.
On a regular basis.
Conveniently, I can also just, you know.
So the stratification, so do you try to get into the weeds on stratification through prior auth and approve some DMARD biologics as an initial add-on to methotrexate? When would you require a second CDMARD, if ever? How do you handle that?
It's not, I mean, looking at our guidelines, it's actually not clear to me that we ever require you to add a second DMARD to methotrexate. The one DMARD that we do require you to fail before moving to a biologic, and I'll put an asterisk next to that and I'll come back to it, is methotrexate. And the asterisk is that we will let you start methotrexate and adalimumab at the same time. Now, our guidelines are also, we have a sort of multi-step process for creating most of our guidelines. And I'm going to be up front too, by the way. It says medical director for medical policy. Now, interestingly, the person who does the pharmacy guidelines and for the DMARDs and the biologics and whatnot is actually people who are not me, because we have a medical director for pharmacy and therapeutics. He couldn't make it. But I do know what the process is, and you know the process is the same across the corporation. And essentially, the first pass is to look at the science. So we would look at the EULAR guidelines. We would look at the ACR guidelines. We actually consult with. Our Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee has a rheumatologist on it, and if it doesn't have a particular expert on it, we invite one in. And so we'll make a first pass at the science and essentially write the guideline that way. Then it goes past, and I may as well be upfront about this, it goes by underwriting, and they cost it. And then it sort of comes back, and it has to make a few rounds through that to sort of get to into an approximate shape that we like. And then it goes to the department called Member Experience. Member Experience is more or less the outfit that says, yeah, people are going to be very, very unhappy if you do X thing. And I'm going to address one specific thing that a number of the patient advocates brought up, which was when you change health plans, you have to change biologics. And again, I'm not going to either say, well, okay, I will say that my company is the best insurer because I actually do think that, not just because I work for them. I wouldn't work for them if I didn't think they were at least very good. But at the same time, you know, you don't, if you change to Tufts Health Plan and you're already established on, I don't know, Actemra, Simponi, whatever, one part of the guideline says that if you're already established on it, then we need to authorize it, and there were good reasons for that it came out of the Member Experience Group. So that's kind of the process. All of that having been said, you know, the science is the beginning of the guideline creation process. And we too are sensitive to the fact that the science is not pure, as Dr. Liang pointed out, but it's the best we have, and we are, willy-nilly required in some ways to pay attention to it because it's the best. It's the evidence we've got.
Rob, do you have anything to?
Still not sure what I'm going to say up here, Steve. I run a Medicaid program, and so the first thing we need to do as a Medicaid program is to follow federal law. And federal law says that we cover medications that participate in the federal rebate program. So our first coverage decision has nothing to do with efficacy or anything. It has to do with working with the federal government. We have a pharmacy and therapeutics committee that is that decides our preferred drug list. They are volunteers, and only in rare exceptions, in fact, I only can think of one, where they make a coverage decision and the department overrules it. And so much of our coverage for medications of any sort are based upon the recommendations of practicing clinicians. We do have a step therapy program in place. You have to use one DMARD before you get to a biologic. Beyond that, we prefer 2 biologics over the others because of the rebate program. But essentially, if you want, or if your provider wants you to have something, there is a short form you fill out, and that form is filled out, is approved about 99.7% of the time. Most denials of medication are because someone forgot to re-enroll in Medicaid, frankly. I would love to have more science here. I'm not sure for Medicaid whether the science is going to matter much longer. You may have read in the newspaper there was an election recently.
Yeah.
And the Medicaid program's probably going to change a great deal. And so for every new therapy that comes along, and we're approaching therapies that are no longer just 6 figures, they're 7 figures, we will be forced to make a decision of, if we're going to cover that, what aren't we going to cover? And I have folks who want to meet with me all of the time to tell me about a new therapy or a new this or a new that is just the most wonderful thing in the world. And none of them have ever come to me in my 9 years at Medicaid to tell me how I would, what I would not cover to pay for their product or their new whatever. And unfortunately, that's the calculus we're going to have to start making. The only thing I would disagree with Dr. Liang is he called our healthcare system broken. We don't have a healthcare system. There's nothing. There is nothing systematic about it. We have multiple systems that interact in different ways or don't, and if there's something systematic about that, I haven't found it yet.
Here, here.
Okay then, we're all feeling cheery. Sun is out, sun is setting. All right, but we're going to fight against the rage against the dying of the light, or whatever that line was. So we're going to keep building this guideline that we weren't going to build, but it again, as it intersects, so we know from our own background, and it's in the report, step therapy is the kind of accepted, it is the standard approach for insurers in this space. But there's a lot of variation in how, not just which drugs, but even when you read the guidelines, I'm always fascinated where guidelines leave open option. You can do A, B, or C, and it makes one wonder, how does a health plan interpret that? Do we cover A, B, or C, or do we decide, oh, A is less expensive and A, B, or C is okay, so let's just cover A, or let's at least have them try A and fail before they do B or C. So it's in those areas where the guidelines are kind of gray, where sometimes that's where the most important flexibility needs to be to address individual patient variation. So one of the questions I was going to ask was when you go through the CDMARD step and you're ready for a biologic, we kept hearing that there's no evidence on which to base a decision of which biologic to start with. And yet, TNF inhibitors are almost always the first class that are covered, basically. The step therapies wouldn't allow you to go from methotrexate to a JAK inhibitor usually. I guess there might be an appeal process. But I'm going to return to the clinical experts. Are there often or ever clearly identified reasons where you know a certain TNF would be right or a certain JAK would be right? I mean, or is there a lot of flexibility and so step therapy is in some ways not clinically irresponsible?
Data-based, it's error-based medicine in the sense that my great teachers, and this I think it was Cecil who said this, that you only use a drug if it's been out for 20 years. For your...
How long has he been dead now? A long time.
And these drugs come out, and of course, and that includes my familiarity with the drug.
Right.
Okay, so I think that we usually start with something that we know and something that we've known for a while, and then the rest is, you know, something we learn about when we start. But I don't have the entire armamentarium at first blush, and so that's how I do it.
So we're fortunate that we're not talking, I mean, a lot of the drugs that are out, you know, have been out for certainly more than 8 years, and there were clinical trials, you know, before that, and patients continue on open label. So how do you pick the drug? I mean, I think, you know, as I think about, you know, a patient in front of me and have active disease and they've failed on methotrexate or another DMARD and we're going to a biologic, I mean, what is that conversation like? And I think that at the very first level, it relates to the clinical efficacy. And you're right, and we've talked about how it's really hard to determine a priori which is the better drug, except in certain kind of unique settings. Somebody with rheumatoid vasculitis or rheumatoid lung disease where certain therapies might be preferred, and then people with really, really active disease where maybe a drug that works rapidly or has a loading dose might be preferred, right? At the next level, though, is safety. And safety is the biggest concern in matching patients with the appropriate drug. So who wouldn't be a candidate for a TNF inhibitor? Somebody who has New York class 3 or 4 congestive heart failure, somebody who has demyelinating disease or a family history strongly positive for it, somebody who has maybe a lupus overlap, somebody where they've had a solid tumor. So the ACR recommends that aside from non-melanoma skin cancer, if you've had a solid tumor within the last 5 years, a number of the biologics are out and you should go to Rituxan. Not a lot of evidence for that, but that's in the guidelines, and as you noted in your report, you know, there are plans here in New England that don't even cover Rituxan as a biologic. So it's efficacy, safety, you know, and then we get down to the route of administration. Is it PO, is it sub-Q, is it IV? If I have a patient and it's 120 miles for them to get to my clinic and they're living in rural North Carolina, you know, the idea that they might take a drug that could be given every 6 months is very appealing to them. A pill might be appealing as well if they could get to that, but often, you know, it takes a while to get to that point. And then cost plays a huge role. If you're not going to take the drug if you can't afford it, and that's where the challenges come in if somebody's going from a commercial plan to Medicare, where a lot of drugs no longer become available unless you've got a low-income subsidy or you have a very generous, you know, drug supplement. So, I mean, all of those are really kind of, you know, rolled in, and compliance plays a role as well. If I have a patient who doesn't appear to be really compliant, how happy would I be that they're home injecting on their own or taking a pill? And so it's a matter of combining them all. When on our call, Dr. Liang talked about the artistry of being a rheumatologist, and so extending that analogy, you know, if you're an artist and you only have 2 colors to paint with, you know, and you're told you've got to wait 6 months before you get another color and then another year and a half with another color, I mean, your work isn't going to be that good.
Interesting. Please, Janet.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that, and would also say that there's a whole lot of direct-to-consumer marketing going on.
Yes.
And I'm a golfer, so I'll take the Phil Mickelson medicine. And so, oh, is he on it? Right, you have to tell me what that is. So that's a powerful influence, and the digital world, social media, has given us as patients an opportunity to blog and communicate. Right. And believe me, before I went on my last biologic medication, there wasn't much data out. It was brand new, and so I was, you know, on the web looking for people to tell me how this has been for them.
interesting. That's a whole nother meeting we could have. I've heard those.
So true.
The social networking around treatments and how patients learn and what's reliable. So one thing that came up earlier, and I wondered again how it connects with the way that coverage policies are, is this idea of induction therapy. That's what some people are calling it. That's a common term now. It's being applied in multiple sclerosis and other, it probably originated in cancer. This idea that hit them hard up front and then back away if you get the kind of response you want. Where's that today in coverage policy? That would mean basically that for a patient with a poor prognostic sign, you would start methotrexate and a biologic together, and then perhaps back off the biologic later, perhaps. Do we have a sense? Because that's, again, one of those toggle switches in the guidelines where you could imagine a health plan viewing it different ways. Do you guys have a view on how payers should view that kind of approach?
Well, I'll take a whack at that first. Connecticut Medicaid is one of the few self-insured Medicaid programs in the country, so we actually have an interest in keeping people well for a long period of time. And so if there's an argument that induction therapy or hitting them hard with methotrexate and adding a biologic would help someone long term to have fewer healthcare costs, I'm there. I came here hoping that you might give me a new step therapy protocol that I might be able to take back and implement on Monday, but I haven't heard it yet.
I still have a couple questions left.
Okay, good. Thank goodness.
But I'm curious from the clinical experts then, is this something that you hear a lot of rheumatologists and maybe patients, this is what they're clamoring for? Would you want to use it, or do you still feel like so many patients or enough patients get benefit with methotrexate that there's no reason to start them off on multiple drugs? What do you think?
I mean, from my experience, what I do is, and I think I do this subconsciously, I have in my head that I have about 6 months to get this person a lot better. And I do whatever it takes to do that. And one of the things that we haven't talked today at all about is the role of prednisone. And I think a lot of rheumatologists, including myself, we use prednisone, and that's a very beneficial thing to a certain point. And so in my brain, I have that in my armamentarium to use as well, but I know that if, say, I have a person who has diabetes, that I can't rely on that very much, if at all. Mm-hmm. And so that is someone who I might want to try to get on a biologic sooner if they're not responding to methotrexate. I use a lot of Plaquenil with methotrexate because there's some data to support that there's a synergistic effect of the two. And so I have this, the guidelines are helpful, but they're guidelines, and every patient truly is different. And all the points that Dr. Laster raised about, comorbidities, patient preference, safety, costs, all of those factors come into play when you're trying to decide. And for me, I have sort of a 6-month, and if I can't get them substantially better, either using the CDI, which is what I use, then I really look to add a biologic at that point.
In terms of the evidence on induction therapy, though, it's still in the kind of TBD
Well, there's
category,
data to
right?
say that if you're more aggressive up front, however you define that, you're going to have a better outcome.
Yes, so I would agree with the aggressive up front, but in reality, I would be surprised if we had an insurance plan that would cover me putting a patient on a DMARD and a biologic concurrently when they came in. And so, I think we're probably, if you look at how we've used methotrexate over the past 20 or 30 years, we're more aggressive now in terms of where we begin. And some people argue, you begin at 15 milligrams orally, and then you go up to 20 after 1 month and 25 after 2 months, and again with folate or folinic acid to minimize any side effects. So in that way, I think somebody comes in with poor prognostic signs, we're on top of them a lot quicker. We're seeing them back quicker, right? That's an issue with the workforce with not enough rheumatologists, getting people back in a timely way that we really need to improve on. And then using steroids initially, again, we're not talking 60 to 80 milligrams, but 15 or 20 milligrams tapered down to 5 over a month can help me identify who is going to be really difficult to handle if they come back and they still have really active disease. Despite that taper of prednisone, I know that I've really got a kind of ramp things up a lot more rapidly.
Okay. So it sounds like, right now at least, you said the payers, you don't think there's a payer out there that would easily allow you to do a biologic and methotrexate from the word go. It is listed as a research priority by the European group. Interestingly, I think their research agenda is dominated by issues of tapering and switching within or across classes, things that we understand would either require really good kind of real-world data or a different research agenda. It's not really, the innovators aren't going to come in and probably want to do a whole lot of research on tapering their drug. It's just, that's usually not where they're going to invest their limited research resources, but it's there. So another question I had about step therapy that might get you, Rob, something new. What sometimes we heard again is that, so the CD-MARD has failed, not working, time for a biologic. Why is it always the TNFs? Is it because, again, we feel safe, they're our old buddy, we've had all these years of experience. We now have new drugs. Tocilizumab, according to our modeling, is cheaper on the net rebate. It only has a single indication, hope I'm getting that right, single indication for RA, whereas adalimumab and etanercept, the others, there may be negotiating or other issues that have to do with how it's used across multiple different indications. But do you get the sense that step therapy does kind of start with the TNFs, and sometimes you have to do 2 TNFs before you move on? Why should step therapy do that? Why shouldn't you be able to go methotrexate, JAK inhibitor?
Because of the economics. I think that, clearly, your data has shown that. There are trials that have looked at this in terms of, if you go from one TNF inhibitor to another, the likelihood of getting into low disease activity is lower with the second TNF inhibitor. Not to say that another TNF inhibitor might not work, and they differ enough in terms of Fab fragments versus monoclonal antibodies to, binding to a fusion protein. So it would be great if we had more biologics to pick and choose from in order to match up the patients more appropriately. And we're concerned that the reason for going with adalimumab or etanercept, which are good drugs and we use them, but to say that that's the only thing you can begin with and that you have to walk through that, doesn't seem appropriate based on the ACR guidelines, based on the data that you've brought together, and we can kind of maybe begin to talk about the drug supply chain and rebates and discounts and what the patient, or their company they work for sees and what the PBM winds up taking home, but it's complicated.
Yeah, maybe I can build on that a little bit. So you brought up the issue of rebates. Rebates are massive in this class of drugs, right? And those rebates create an economic disincentive to compete on price. So we are, Regeneron, Sanofi, Genzyme, we are launching a new drug. There's very little incentive for us to price it, low and compete on price, because the price doesn't matter. We're not going to get better access in the marketplace if we compete on price. In any other market in economics, there's a downward sloping demand curve. The lower you set your price, the more quantity you will sell, assuming you have a product that people are valuing and that they are willing to buy. But you don't have that here. So as a result, you have costs that are continuing to go up and up and up. There's no limit to it because there's absolutely no incentive to compete on price for any of the actors. It's a market that creates perverse incentives to raise prices. You're better off raising your prices and giving payers an even bigger rebate over time than to compete on price. So those companies that have set up, that came first, there's a clear first mover advantage here. So don't want to blame any fingers, but point any fingers or blame anyone. But the way the system is set up is in a way that it will lead, by definition, to these perverse outcomes.
All right. Well, I wasn't going to bring up pricing, but thank you for doing it.
So somebody has to do it.
Somebody has to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody has to do it. I want to actually, could one of you get that earlier slide I used during the introduction up, just so I can talk about it later? Rob, you wanted to follow on to that.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. You know, Connecticut Medicaid 2 years ago was the second state in the country to cover all of the hepatitis C meds without any requirements other than to demonstrate that you were using the right medication for the right serotype. And the reason we did that was that they were curative, and there was evidence to show that within 5 to 7 years they would be cost effective. If somebody would show me that research on any medication, whether it be this class of medications or others, that there is an evidence base to show that they work and that they will work in a reasonable period of time, we'll cover them. But to release them and show that they are X% better than placebo tells me nothing. Show me the evidence of, studies against other medications, and we will cover the ones that work and are cost effective over time. We cover people for the long period, and so it's in our interest to do that. We just don't see the data to be able to make those decisions.
Okay.
So I can make a
Please,
couple of
Himanshu.
comments. With regards to the step therapy, even the American College of Rheumatology supports that, on the physician side, there certainly is a lot of burden for the physicians in terms of having these non-standardized prior authorizations that tends to take up a lot of time, and then a delay in treatment, and then the issue of switching. And I think forced switching if patients change plans. Even as you were stating, even in your data, you have over 50% of the plans that require a minimum of two TNF inhibitors before moving on. So I think clearly that's a point of frustration for physicians that are sort of in that position. I think you would have to be living under a rock if you didn't understand anything about what's going on with price in terms of it just being mentioned. I think something that education is certainly something that's required and needed, and I think price transparency is really a good start, because I think it really differentiates. Just kind of following along, really what's the difference between the list price and the net price? And for example, Lilly just joined a couple other companies in terms of releasing price transparency. And you're seeing upwards of 50% reduction off of list price when you're looking at the numbers. And that you talk about net price increases, meaning minus rebates, you're talking about single-digit numbers. And this is just sort of the conversation and discussion that needs to be had, I think, moving on in the future, and have some of this cost savings that does translate into patient benefit in terms that, at the counter.
All right, let me build off of that. I put back up the slide on net pricing of many of these drugs. 2016, the price that would be required to meet the threshold that ICER has traditionally used is the top end of cost effectiveness. And then how many years back you'd have to go to get that net price. So I understand what you just said about, Lilly's list versus net price, but if we look up there, we see relatively massive changes in net prices over the past 3 to 4 years, going up, all of them. So I have two questions. For the payers, you've got a situation where the guidelines from the best clinical societies here and in the world are saying you can pick almost any drug from a pretty wide set, and even in the same class, if you have a failure, you can try another one from that class and you'll often get results. That seems set up for doing really tough negotiation and getting better prices for your patients and for the public. You failed. Why?
I think Andreas actually referred to some of that. That pharmaceutical companies, near as I am able to ascertain, again, not having been part of many of these discussions, don't actually necessarily compete on price itself. They compete on rebate. And what they compete on, basically, the use of rebates is to position their product in a specific place or a better place on the formulary. We'd like to be step 1, or we'd like to be step 2 on your formulary. And if you give us step 2, we will cut you a rebate of X%, X amount, and that doesn't change the price. And it doesn't even change necessarily the net, I understand, yes, and the net price with rebates, but it still doesn't change that. Because at the end of the day, we are still tied to the fact that, as you say, the best science that we have available says that we have to use at least some of these drugs. And I would argue from the Medicaid perspective, because Tufts Health Plan does have a Medicaid arm, I'll call it. If it's approved, we pretty much are, in effect, we have to cover it to some extent, to a level. We're tied to the same federal issues that he is, but also, if someone says, well, that didn't work, you have to give us this other thing, well, we have to give them the other thing. And there's a lot less, availability of price incentives on the Medicaid side. And there's no availability of price incentives on the Medicare side. And as I recollect the numbers, I haven't looked at them recently, somewhere on the order of half of healthcare, or perhaps a bit more, is paid for by federal dollars where price incentives are not available.
Maybe I can say
Rob?
one thing about the rebates again. So in some cases, yes, you compete on not just on net price, but on rebates. But in this particular market, you have two really entrenched actors that make this competition very, very difficult, or almost quite impossible. We could give sarilumab away for free,
Okay.
for a price of zero. But don't be so fast,
Sorry.
because even at a price of zero, I don't think he would step people through sarilumab. It would still be economically more advantageous for you to still step them through Humira, because there's so many people on Humira, and I'm not making this up. I mean, I looked at these numbers. We have one indication. Humira has, 13?
Right.
Tons of patients on there. So you would lose money by going with a drug that costs you nothing, because you might lose some of the rebate that you get from AbbVie.
Because we lose it for the people who have the other diagnosis.
Yes, all these NRXs that you have on the TRXs that you have on there, the NRXs that would come from the new patients starting on sarilumab would never make up for the rebate you're losing. So that's the problem in the marketplace, and we talked about RA today, but this is a problem that's almost even bigger in some of these other immunological conditions, because the formularies are designed for the drugs that came first. Now, so good drugs in RA. In psoriasis, for example, etanercept, has, there are other drugs that do a lot better than etanercept, but people still have to go through etanercept, because the formulary was designed with, RA in mind. When I spoke to dermatologists in my previous role, when I worked for a company that had a dermatology product, those dermatologists said that that these companies and insurance companies and manufacturers are holding dermatologists hostage with their formularies, because those drugs that are great for RA may not be the best for psoriasis, or the best for ankylosing spondylitis, or Crohn's disease or whatnot.
So back to the payers again. I obviously give really soft pitches, and that was one of them. Why have you failed us? There's obviously a deep system. We talk about deep state. This is a deep system. Is this an area where we should be calling for indication-specific pricing and formulary design, with the idea being that if we can disentangle the indications and the rebates, it might allow a more clear view of the relative effectiveness and value within an indication, which does get tangled in this web across different indications. Is that an easy suggestion that's still hard to do? Are there any downsides to it?
It's a great suggestion. I think that, and I think Andreas actually pointed out why it would be hard to implement. I'm just looking at this is our guideline, Tufts Health Plan's guideline for Humira. Let's see: ankylosing spondylitis, Crohn's disease, hidradenitis suppurativa, juvenile idiopathic arthritis, plaque psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and ulcerative colitis, and uveitis. There's a whole stack of things in there. And if I suspect, and I don't know, but I suspect that were we to say, for patients with rheumatoid arthritis, we will allow you to go past Humira and go straight to sarilumab. Sorry, beg pardon. So direct to sarilumab. Then our Humira representative would be knocking on our door that following week saying, yeah, so that rebate we gave you, we're taking that back now. that's the market power that they have. They have the power to give or take away the rebate based on our coverage policies. And that is, in a sense, the stranglehold that particularly the early movers have, because the early movers also have had more time to see whether their product works for more disease states.
Right. And the reason you can't say to, I'm not going to use individual names, it gets a little dicey, but the reason you couldn't say to a market leader, because the guidelines say we can use any of your class, you're trying to play hardball with us, we're just not going to cover you. We've got other options there, and we're willing to take the hit in RA because they would give you a less good deal on all the other indications where they're the only drug? Is that the basic power game, power dynamic
It's
that we're
more
talking
than
about?
that, because it's not just the indications, it's the number of patients on the drugs.
Understood.
The total number of
Understood.
patients that these rebates
Sandy?
I just wanted to point out that there is no federal legislation that gives the feds authority to look at what PBMs are doing, that they're regulated exclusively on the state level, and Congress has just now introduced a bill on PBMs and oversight and transparency. So this whole issue of drug pricing is just beginning to be understood. I don't think that people really understood that if you priced your drug lower, you would lose traffic and not be at an advantageous point in the formulary. So this is a big secret, and I think that's important to understand, that this counterintuitive math is not well known.
Yeah. Well, let me ask another what if. So for the payers again, forgive me, if something happened to the system and you felt kind of what Rob was saying, you felt that you were getting prices, net prices, that aligned, you know, with the added benefit to patients, with good evidence that this was accomplishable in the real world for real patients over time. Is that equated in your mind with, I'm almost restating what Rob said, but is that equated in your mind with the possibility of relaxing step therapy, or, you know, either abolishing it or at least changing it in some way? If the prices were to come into the red zone there, would it change the way you think payers generally would look at issues of step therapy?
I think payers would like to look at it that way. I think Tom, you know, and Andreas made the point very well that it's complex, and there's a multiple number of factors that come into how these things are priced. But I think what I would point out is that, yeah, we may prefer one or two of the medications in this area, but that our PA requirements are very thin. You fax in a form that takes 2 seconds to fill out. And yet there's very few of our patients who have been moved to some of these other medications by the providers. And I think a lot of the providers, or enough of the providers, know that the PA requirements are not that difficult. They're just not choosing to make those changes. Some don't, but I think enough of them do know that our PA requirements are pretty liberal, and they're choosing not to make those changes.
Okay. Tom?
I think that one of the things, it would be, I think we would like to, I was going to put it that way. I think we would like to, but I think one of the first things we do is sort of stand back a little bit and essentially what I'm going to call watch provider behavior. In the sense of, you know, if provider behavior starts to align with the relative value of these medications as they are priced, then it will then start to make sense to simply say, you know what, let's step away from this whole process, and because providers are already doing it right.
So, and is that, I talked about, is this an argument for indication-specific pricing? Is that an argument for suggesting that accountable care organizations and other physician groups should start to bear financial risk for these drugs and start to kind of grapple with the costs and cost-effectiveness?
I can't think of an argument against it, no.
All right. So,
Is it an argument for pay for performance? And to go ahead and tell pharmaceutical companies, you know, like Harvard Pilgrim is doing with their drugs, you know, we'll go ahead and pay this amount if you get your patient into low disease activity, or if your patient remains compliant with an anabolic drug, you know, there's going to be, or if you're not compliant, you get money back. Can you remove the PBM middleman? You know, they're arguing that we're keeping costs down, but the way they're doing it is it's a quid pro quo. It's, you know, well, go ahead and your drug will be the only drug offered on the formulary for number one. and that's how we drive the cost down because you're going to give us this big discount. But what if that wasn't in the mix and you now had the manufacturers talking directly to, plan sponsors or physicians in the community?
Yeah. Part of that sounded like what Matt was suggesting earlier, which was get your patient to the best, to a good point. We'll give, let you do it however you want to do it, but get there, and there's kind of a pay-for-performance element to that.
The other
so-
thing, Steve, too, I think
Tracy,
you're going to get to this, but
Maybe.
it's fascinating to me always when I have, the difference between my Medicare patients and how I choose and my private pay patients and Medicaid. I would put Medicaid in the private pay. On the Medicare side, I have basically five IVs that I can pick from. And they don't have to go through step therapy. I look at those 5 IV therapies and decide which one would probably work best for them. And I think we're going to get to talking about this, but because for those patients, for the patient themselves, they probably will have lower out-of-pocket costs if they bill through their Part B than if they go through their Part D benefit.
Yeah.
And so that's another whole,
Another, yeah.
another whole, but it's an important part
Yes.
in talking about these drugs
Right.
and how we choose. But we don't go through step therapy for the Part B side.
Right. Right.
You're actually picking which one you think person might benefit the best from to start with.
Okay. So we're getting close to a point where I'm going to ask each of you, you can start to think of it now, I'm going to ask each of you, if you had one request of another stakeholder in this system, what would it be? One thing that somebody else, so if you're a patient, you could say, what would it be? You could ask of the payers, of the manufacturer, of research community. So everybody start to think what your ask would be. In the meantime, I wanted to recognize and thank the drug representatives who are here, and I'm about to hit you with a hard question. So I'm sorry, I understand the role that PBMs play. Of course, they only exist because there was a perceived market need. They could get carved out by the payers tomorrow if they wanted to. But PBMs notwithstanding, those are net prices doubling over 3 to 4 years. So cry me a river, drug industry, about the role of PBMs. You guys are raking in huge net increases year on year, and patients aren't seeing any of that in terms of new evidence that the drugs are better. It's hurting access because it seems to reinforce this idea that step therapy is the only way we can manage the costs of these therapies. So is it a reasonable request to the drug industry kind of system-wide to at least not highly raise prices on a net basis year after year when there's no evidence of increased effectiveness in the marketplace?
Yeah, as I said earlier, drug companies are better off. They're, at least those market leaders that have, those drugs that are used first on the formulary, they're better off raising prices and giving a bigger rebate back to their PBM or
So they're not giving back that bigger rebate.
Say what?
They're not giving back that bigger rebate on these drugs.
Right, but they solidify their position on the formulary. They make it more expensive for the insurer to say no to them. So yes, the net price doesn't change, but they're in a much better bargaining position 2-3 years down the road when these contracts get renegotiated.
So the drug companies bear no responsibility for the increase in net prices that are shown there?
So Regeneron is not on that list.
I'll try not to take it personally. I guess I'm looking for a little bit of shared pain here.
So I can say a couple things. So just to be clear, I'm on the medical side. I have nothing to do with pricing, so I am not involved in that at all. But I'm really glad that some of this conversation took place. This whole issue that the playing field is sort of unfair, especially for the single indication type agents that we have. And I really think in terms of this solution, it's not really going to be about just telling one entity to do something. I think, if you just have to face reality, the PBMs have a huge 70-80% market share of the environment here. So, they're going to be real players, and we do have to work with them. I think, again, I bring the issue of price transparency because you know, and I can't speak for the other companies, you'd have to look at it, but I mean, just for instance, with Lilly across all the drugs, it was a 2.6% increase in net pricing. So that's nowhere near the numbers that you see out there that are all based off of list pricing. And certainly, I think things do need to change, and we need to look at the issue as a whole. I think the idea of value-based agreements is something that certainly has a lot of merit to it, but I think we also have to come with the understanding and limitations of that the policies and regulations really would not allow for that at this time and point to scale this up. So, you know, these are all movements in the right direction, though.
Okay. So, from a process perspective, I was going to invite them to, you know, their ask of the system from a policy perspective, and then we'll have the CPAC give kind of final comments. Before I do that, do you guys have any questions that you'd like to pose to the policy roundtable? Yes. And please remind them kind of where you work and.
Sure. Kim Lenz, thank you all for your comments. So, clinical pharmacy manager for the Massachusetts Medicaid program, so I felt compelled to speak because I feel like you see one Medicaid program, you've seen one Medicaid program. And so I appreciate everybody's comments today about access and making sure we are accepting of that and letting you have your doctor-patient relationship. So I can speak for our plan. You know, I sent Celia a change to the report too. Actually, in Massachusetts, we only have a trial of one DMARD, and then we don't specifically go through a TNF prior to other biologics. But so I think that's important. But you asked a good question about, is it important to have like a disease-specific preferred product when we get into the conversations about pricing? And I think that's a great thing to do, but I think you have to realize, and we have it structured that way on the inside of our clinical guidelines, but I think from a point of view of a patient of yours walking into a pharmacy to get their prescription, if you want to have something like that structured, you have to have a system configuration that allows the system to grab the diagnoses at the point of sale. And that's trickier than you would think. So I think short of having you submit a PA for every single drug you want to prescribe, so we could make sure, you know, this one's for psoriasis and this one's for RA, that's pretty tricky. It can be done, but it is a little bit harder than you think. And then to the point about Dr. Kuznick's point about, you know, you'll offer Sibelumab for free, I think you're...
That was hypothetical.
You just want to sign, right?
You're on TV.
Yeah, no, you know, I think what we do, and I'm sure all of the payers do this too, you know, we have to create our guideline based on complete evidence first, and then your pricing to us comes completely after that fact. So it's true, if you offered that for free and we had all these patients in the market share on Humira, we're still going to let those people on Humira continue their drug. If you want to give it to us for free, and anybody who chooses to select, you know, Siroliumab, that's totally fine. So I think you can't make that comment without understanding that it would be unfair to make that comment and then impact access on the other side.
Yeah, in some Medicaid program, this may be exactly right, but there are other many commercial insurance claims where we literally could give it away for free without improving our access position. It was more
I
general.
think you ought to test that in the room.
I run the numbers.
No, I'm just...
I run the numbers.
I know. We're teasing you for being a good guy. All right.
And
So-
I think one last thing, I think that I think the pay for performance idea, I think it's coming. I'm actually probably more excited about healthcare than maybe Rob had alluded to. I don't have such a bleak outlook on our future, but you know, I think we are moving, at least in Massachusetts, towards accountable care organizations, and I think that barrier between, you know, prescriber, payer, manufacturer, I'm hoping that it actually drives us all more towards a unified approach.
Okay, lightning round for a policy roundtable. In less than a minute, can you please tell us what you would hope to see as far as some change from either a policy or the actions of a stakeholder in the system that you think would be really helpful in trying to deal with this issue of trying to, again, getting evidence into the system, trying to continue to sustain innovation while creating a system for RA patients where they can get access and we can have it lined up with value so that the pricing, et cetera, creates a system that we can afford in the world that Rob sees coming forward. So, Dr. Lester, start with you. Less than a minute.
For everybody, right? And not just
It can
me.
be. Yes.
A real challenge because of the prices have gone up, and you know, we've heard that there are many people involved in that at many different levels. Yeah, I look to the idea about pay for performance. You know, that the idea that at the end of the day, the rheumatologist working with the patient is really going to be the ideal in terms of where we need to be, right? To include all of the complexity of that care, and if we could come up with a way in which we can capture that data, you know, that is clinically relevant in terms of low disease activity, patient-reported outcomes, and we could then reimburse appropriately companies that had that drug, and others that didn't meet that criteria, you know, would have to pay money back. I'm not sure how that system would work, but I think at the end of the day, you know, that's going to be true and honest and is going to help patients get better. And it puts rheumatologists back in terms of they're under the gun to go ahead and try to be more appropriate, to get them on methotrexate to get the level. If they fail, then go to the DMARD, use the right DMARD, go to treat to target. So, you know, everybody has some skin in the game.
Thank you. Himanshu.
I would probably go to the physicians. I think the practicing physicians obtaining real-world evidence. I think that is clearly a missing piece of the puzzle. We don't see enough of that. And, you know, doing that real-world evidence in conjunction with registries, I think will be really important. You know, one of the things that we always struggle with is, you know, when we deal with patient compliance and patient adherence of therapy, understanding how are physicians really prescribing these medicines, how often are they switching, why are they switching, you know, these things are really important, and I think it really, we really need to expand that knowledge outside of just clinical trials to advance.
Good. You guys are doing well. Thank you. Good ideas, and thank you for keeping it short. Janet?
And that just teed this up for me. So pay for performance, absolutely, but that's not going to be successful without patient engagement. And so I would really emphasize the need to engage patients in continuous monitoring of their disease process as well as their response to medication, because we still don't have really good definitions of what inadequate response really is. In diabetes care, we do. High blood pressure care, we do. But in RA care, we don't. And often switching takes place based on vague patient requests or other aspects. So we really need a good clinical definition of that. And there's some really good measures out there. Even the ACR 50 and 20 are really continuous measures, but we've used them in a dichotomous way through clinical trials just to take a snapshot. So the patient's going to have to be engaged in monitoring their care in a partnership with their physician and provider, so that that whole model of shared decision-making really can be actualized.
Right,
And we must have economic transparency. Throw that in.
Thanks. Sandy?
So I can echo everything that's just been said, but I want to just quickly tell you about a project that the Arthritis Foundation undertook last fall. Our CEO and a member of our board of directors, who's a former CEO of WebMD and also Wyeth and Pfizer executive, met with stakeholders in the healthcare system, because our advocates and our board members were saying, what are you guys doing about this problem? And we met with pharma companies, senior executives from pharma companies. We met with hospital associations. We met with PBMs. We held 100 patient interviews. And the question was, what would you tell patients? What could we do that could help patients deal with the challenges that they're facing? What we learned is that all of the business models in the healthcare system are diametrically opposed. So what one player wants is not what another player wants. And while everyone said that we care about patients, the patient is sort of drowning in the paperwork having to do with appeals. I know your insurance company is very friendly, but we did not hear that from our patient population, that they can access information. Most patients work 9 to 5. Insurance companies don't have any evening hours. And they also are not even aware of the assets that are available to them from the pharma companies. You know, a lot of people didn't understand a copay card, didn't understand they could call a pharma company and get help with an appeal. So I would ask that everyone put on a new pair of glasses and refocus on the needs of the patient, because they're feeling very alone and they are really drowning in all of this paperwork and all of this lack of transparency.
Thank you. Thanks. Matt? Can you just press your button there, please? Matt, can you press the button? Thanks.
So, real life. I mean, there's ample experience. It's not trivial how to do this. And it's going to take some infrastructure and organization that hasn't really been successful. We could get into that in depth. The other thing is it's likely to be based on sentinel practices, not the whole world. But we can talk about that as well. I think every party feels like we're subject to moral hazard. Mm-hmm. We're talking about it, but we don't have any skin in the game. Even the patients, you have the most skin in the game, but then you have to understand how you're going to get it. So to me, we need to do more interdisciplinary conversations like you're doing, which I really appreciate. I've learned a lot today. But I would think about getting a cognitive psychologist involved or behavioral economists to tell how we can make pricing more transparent so you can accomplish your needs, or whether that makes any difference.
All right, thank you. Robert?
First of all, Kim, I'm optimistic. Just doesn't look that way on a Friday. If you look at the cost of healthcare delivery in this country over the past 50 years, it's gone up about 1% to 2% a year. The cost of healthcare administration has exploded. And in large part, all of that has been to save money, which is absurd, but there you have it. If we do away with that and move towards value-based purchasing, then I think that would be the thing that I would ask for. But it has to be done value-based. It has to be purchasing a value based upon actual clinical outcomes, so that folks actually are getting better. The pharmaceutical industry has done wonderful things in the past 50 years. All of the things that I used to care for as a resident, where I knew that kids were going to die of diseases, they survive those diseases now. Some of those diseases don't exist. But we're also bankrupting ourselves too, and you can't have it both ways. But I think maybe we can if we look and plan accordingly.
Thank you. Tom?
Thank you. I too can share your enthusiasm, at least for ACOs, in the sense that it's the one thing, in my personal opinion, that will, or at least has the potential to get all of the important parts of healthcare in the room to open up and examine the enormous package of perverse incentives that we are currently saddled with, shaped like a health plan or a health system. And that's a very large conversation that needs to happen at a bunch of levels, but the ACO model is, in my personal opinion, sort of the way that's going to start. So essentially my ask of more or less everyone in this room is, you know, if there's any way you can participate in and advocate for that kind of dialogue, that would be great.
So I guess I will answer. So, you used the word perverse incentive. I was hoping to use that. Sorry. So this is a classic, in my mind. This is a case of market failure. You have all these weird incentives that result in a less than optimal outcome. I don't think you can trust the actors in this marketplace to change that somehow, because all the actors are doing the right thing from their point of view. Insurance companies, essentially, they're private companies. They are beholden to stockholders. The manufacturers are private companies. So they're all doing the right thing, yet the outcome is bad. And I think this is the place where regulators need to step in. And by regulators, I don't mean the FDA, because this is not something that falls within the purview of the FDA, but I mean the Department of Justice. I think there's anti-competitive behavior here. I'm not a lawyer, so don't take my word for granted, but I think that I can see some anti-competitive behavior where a marketplace is not allowed or not able to compete on price. And that kind of thing, I think, I'm not an expert in this field, but I think the Department of Justice would sort of handle that if they ever looked at it. I don't know.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Now, before we get a chance to thank you, I hope you can stay for the final comments of the CPAC, and then we'll wrap up with a major thank you for your contributions. I'd like to start over on this side. Al, again, just for the CPAC, if you have any final conclusion or again, idea that you want to make sure gets kind of recognized as we head out. It could be a key theme that you want to emphasize, or you can pass. But if we can try to do that very quickly, about a minute or so if we go around.
Well, one thing that resonated very much with me today is the patient engagement and just hearing the stories and the actual experience. That hit home, and I had shared this with Gina. I said, that really was very powerful. We talk about cost and all of these other things, but, patient engagement is so vitally important, especially as we start to look at how are we going to resolve this complexity or get some resolve out of it. So I just want to acknowledge that and stress the fact that that was so meaningful for you to share your experience.
Thank you, Jean.
So I want to echo Al on that, and thank you very much for doing that. It reaffirmed a lot of what I had felt during our reading of all these reports. I think this review is a good argument for nomenclature reform in the pharmaceutical industry, because it was really hard to keep track of all these names. But so I don't know much about that, but I do know a lot about health systems, and this represents, and I had my head about blowing off a few times during today, a colossal health system failure. And I think we all own a piece of that, with the patients owning the very smallest piece of trying to do the best they can and having months and weeks and years of their lives taken away either by their illness or by trying to cope with all of our ways of forcing them to deal with their illness. So that makes me pretty angry. I am usually a cost hawk and a supply side healthcare hawk, but today I feel like we have just heard, and with all affection and respect for all of us here, we just heard everybody pass the buck. So the payer said it needs to go to the providers. Pharma said it needs to either go to the payers or the providers. Everybody said pharma needs to lower their prices. We all own a piece of this, and we better figure it out quick, because RA is only a tiny sliver of this problem. It's a perfect example for us to deal with, but if we can't figure out this defined problem where we have had great success in treating it and figure out how to get it paid for without torturing people through step therapy that has no value, no clinical value, and adds cost to everybody, then we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. So sorry.
It's hard to pick up from there. So, yeah, I think I said my piece on healthcare. I think we have some hope going forward, but I guess my takeaway is, again, trying to reiterate what I think we've all talked about today is access and individuality for patients and making sure they have the appropriate treatment. So my ask, I think, would be to, if next time you're on the phone with a payer, you have to spend time writing out that PA form that you're frustrated with, write how you think that it should be in their plan. Give them some basis to help justify why things should change instead of complaining about the process.
Well, to quote a certain well-known political figure, healthcare is more complicated than anybody knew. Another thought is that this particular presentation brings home one of the true complexities, which is that for almost any condition, there's a real spectrum of disease which requires a real flexibility in approach. And we tend to forget that. We tend to say, well, if you've got this and this and this, we've got a diagnosis, and the treatment is that and that and that. And as several people said in different ways, it's not really that way. It's much more complicated. So what we're going to come out of here with one of these brilliant CPAC reports is a partial telling of the story. It's only going to be the beginning.
The first note I wrote to myself was early in the meeting when there was a criticism that there was an over-reliance on randomized clinical controlled trial data I wrote it as a relative wealth of good data on which to make decisions. And it was using those data and the comments from the patient representatives that really made me realize that these are miracle drugs for what they've done for people's quality of lives. But miracle drugs aren't priceless. We have recognized, I think, over and over today, that there are limits to what we can spend on healthcare. There were some distractions early in the day that we didn't like that notion, but in the next hour and a half or so, we've been told there's going to be a vote, or maybe there won't be a vote. But why this is difficult is because we need to limit healthcare spending, and I'm glad we fully acknowledge that today. And we had some discussions about that yesterday that were also very helpful.
Jason.
Thank you. What struck me the most was this issue of misaligned incentives, and that all parties feel that their own incentives are not aligned with doing the thing that patients need the most. It really struck me. I think I've already referenced my frustrating experience with the prior auth this week, so I will not do so again. But ultimately, although I was upset for a couple of days about this, nothing that I have ever experienced could ever even come close to what some of the patients have expressed today in terms of their frustrations with these sort of prior authorization, approval denial systems. It's a wasteful process from an economic perspective. It may, in this particular disease condition, lead to pain, fear, worry, and actually real deterioration in health status that's durable. So those are real issues. And then, with respect to this particular disease area, this is in an area where there is actually a shortage of rheumatologists. Mm-hmm. I know from our own training programs, it's not the most popular internal medicine subspecialty, at least in our system. And so in that setting, if we have areas, we don't want Teresa on the phone with prior auths. We want her seeing patients in Vermont with RA and other conditions. And that's a real economic problem that needs to be addressed. So I do hope there's a better negotiation and a better process. I don't know if the Department of Justice is the right venue. I think they're going to be busy, to be honest with you, the next few weeks. But I do hope that someone can get the right players in the room. And then the last point I want to make is just sort of a technical point. My organization, I'm at the Mass General, part of Partners Healthcare. We're very much into ACOs already. And I do actually think that ACOs are largely effective. A large part of my research agenda is evaluating public policies, and a lot of these value-based purchasing and ACO type policies have improved outcomes, but there are limitations to them. Often limitations around adverse selection. So the one doctor that's known to be the best and gets the toughest cases, there'll be usually inadequate risk adjustment for that physician. And there's a lot of issues with data and attribution. So it may seem conceptually simple to say, Teresa, we're going to pay you a different amount for the patient's status that you see, but if someone sees someone else when they're on vacation in Florida, attribution can be very challenging. It's not to say that I don't believe in value-based purchasing in ACOs. I really do, but the data, we need to work hard on the technical aspects with the data. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this whole session.
Rob.
So an awful lot of our presenters have talked about the absence of real-world or real-life data, and that seems to be the critical missing piece here. I mean, Dan and John did an extraordinary evidence report, but they were bound by the limits of what we're gleaning from RCTs. The good news is I think we actually do have a lot of that data. It's in all payer claims databases, it's in health information exchanges, but it's really hard to get a hold of. Medicaid data is really hard to get a hold of. Medicare data is hard to get a hold of. And then once you get it, it's hard to do anything meaningful with it. But it seems to me that's the way to bring these evidence reviews and the cost effectiveness, especially to an entirely different level, because now we get insights into provider behavior, patient behavior, real world utilization patterns, patient comorbidities, all of that. We really need to have that and need to find a way to incorporate that into our reviews and projections.
Right. So I just want to echo the importance of real world data and using it as well as the fact that the patients have really gotten lost in this, between the shortage of the rheumatologists that can treat them, and then the fact that once you get to a rheumatologist, you need to have your condition under control sooner rather than later for your long-term health outcomes, and you're faced with bureaucracy of step therapy and no unclear guidelines about which drug will work for which patient. We should focus on fixing it.
Thank you. Teresa.
I always have to go last. So obviously this is an area that's very near and dear to me, and I've thought about my patients throughout this whole time. And when I look at the report and I think about what I can take away, I do agree that this is part of the story. The real world, we always do struggle with real world, and I do commend ICER and what they've done, and I think it's been a tremendous work. But at the end of the day, I'll be very honest, it's hard to know how I'll use this right now. Because of the constraints that we have from our insurance companies in terms of what drugs I get to pick. I do call a lot and ask for exceptions when I think that they're necessary. Most of the time, starting out with the drugs that are recommended are fine, but I do think that we do need to have a more nimble, easier process to get exceptions. But I think to come back to the patient, and when I started practicing, I was right around when abatacept came out, or Orencia, so around 2005, and to see the number of new drugs come out, it's hard to keep up with them. And to see the choices that I have, it is tremendous. And I have a lot of elderly patients who did not have those choices. And it's very humbling to see the differences in outcome between those sets of patients. And I do sometimes, some tongue-in-cheek, tell some of my patients that it's a lot easier to treat someone now with rheumatoid arthritis than it is to treat someone with osteoarthritis, because we do have these choices. So I go back to my patients, and that's where I learn, and that's why I keep going.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I have several tasks to do as we kind of wrap up. Oh,
Before
sure,
you
Sandy.
wrap up,
Go ahead.
we'd love to hear what your reactions
Oh, you'll get it. Don't worry. You didn't think you were going to escape without. No.
I was hoping not.
No. But first, I said I have several tasks. That will be one of them. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the folks who've come to be on our policy roundtable today. They put themselves at our service. They actually help us during the report. Many of them help us during the report derivation. Sandy, thank you, you and your organization, for doing the work to get evidence to help inform us, and to obviously the others in the audience as well. But for all of you on the Policy Roundtable, I just wanted to express our thanks. Without your willingness to come and to speak civilly, with respect, but very honestly, we wouldn't accomplish what we hope to accomplish with these meetings. So for all of us, please join me in thanking our Policy Roundtable. And Andreas, see, you've suggested selling your drug for free, and
I hate that it always comes up. It was a hypothetical.
And
just to make a mathematical point.
And I believe you called for regulation of drug pricing. So there are jobs available at ICER. So after you get home, if you make it back. Secondly, I would like to thank also, as they did often, the people who came to participate from the audience to give public comments. Again, many of you helped us throughout with submitted comments, but also your engagement with us today. There's a piece of this which is so important to us, which is the civil discourse with the broader public. And to hear your voices as part of that is absolutely essential. So for the spirit with which you came, for the fact that you sat on these hard chairs for the entire day, I'd like everybody to give you all a hand for your participation. And CPAC, thank you for your dedication. This was, again, we used to pride ourselves that our reports, we said we are not going to make reports that are doorstops. This one, I think, would have stopped a small tank. It was, it was that dense and that difficult. And the CPAC really hangs with us and reads through these materials and obviously takes a lot of their questions into the public as well to wrestle with it with us. So in addition to their amazing perspectives on the healthcare system, we appreciate the diligence that they pay in looking at the evidence and keeping us all honest. So for all the CPAC members, thank you very much. Thank you. So my reflections, I come out of this meeting with a strange mixture of optimism and despair. The despair is based on just how awful a system can be. But I mean, in some weird ways, you know, we've had some topics where patients have been waiting for the first treatment and are just desperate to get something. Here we have wonderful innovation over time that's made tremendous benefits, and we're still stuck in the swamp somehow. And that's what's the disheartening part, because it feels like the science, the innovation has been brilliant, the ability to transform patients' lives, brilliant, and yet our system, so to speak, as Rob said, has put patients still in a bad situation, and it's left people who have a very good intent trying to figure out how to change the grinding gears in a way that makes sense. So sometimes we wrestle with what's our role? How can we, you know, are we trying to just grease a terrible machine just to keep it alive, sputtering down? You know, somebody said your report just somehow emphasizes a rebate-driven system. That is the last thing we hope to do. What we hope to do, though, is again based off my optimism, which is we can still, even in tough times, have a meeting based on evidence in which people are willing to say that evidence needs to be the anchor for our ability to come together and talk through some difficult choices. We need to think hard and critically. We need to be able to admit with humility where we have certainty and where we don't. And yet we have to keep moving forward. We can't let uncertainty kind of just stop us and say, well, we can't make decisions. Decisions are going to be made. And the optimism is also in the fact that around these tough issues, we can have conversations really highlighted by the level of civil discourse on evidence today, and have people come and say, this is going to be hard. What we hope is that not just this meeting, but the report, you know, it will be viewed by a lot of people, and there will be questions asked about the clinical effectiveness. You know, what did our report add to the knowledge base of payers, many of whom do not have the sophistication, the personnel of the folks that you've seen at the Policy Roundtable today. So we hope that our report will help summarize for them the important clinical evidence that really will kind of raise some new questions about step therapy. It may not suggest that it goes away, and there are lots of issues around that you've heard today, but it will raise new perspectives on it, and I think that's an important part of what we hope to do. And then it will raise the question about innovation, but at what price? And how do we come together to say we want and we cherish innovation that brings real benefits to patients, and we have to figure out how to pay for it in a responsible way. And that really is going to be something we all have to do. But our reports are used not to answer that question as much as to help people frame the question for action. So whether it's new forms of payment contracts that will pay for performance, whether it's thinking harder yet again about how to make indication-specific formulary pricing approaches work, different ways to try to be innovative on the pricing and payment side. That's a very strong hope on our part that our reports can stir up that kind of innovation, and not just have people kind of use the old switches of on, off, third tier, first tier, because that's what's led us to where we are now. And it's not, you know, just keep on doing the same thing's not going to get us out of that boat. So reasons for concern, a broken system in many ways, innovation we want to acknowledge and welcome, and an abiding sense that we may face limitations in the healthcare system, but I really feel like there's almost no limit to what we could accomplish if we can keep having this kind of work across the table with everybody there. So I hope that you will all continue with us. We'll work with folks after these meetings. It's not like we just drop it and run. So we look forward to working with folks, and maybe there will be some changes coming in the healthcare system that will allow some new ways to use this kind of evidence to help patients going forward. So safe travel home. Looks like the snow's stopped. Thank you again for coming. Thank you to the ICER staff for all their work on this report and the meeting, and thank you again.